decline, retrenchment, and withdrawal. Really?
Well, here's some examples that support that characterization. Number one, at a minimum, the commander-in-chief and the leader of the free world and the President of the United States needs to lend moral clarity and rhetorical strength to the values and principles that we support and embrace here and around the world. So at the beginning of the Green Revolution in 2009, when you had people standing in Iran asking, where does the United States stand, and the President stands essentially mute on those issues, that is a form of flinching, withdrawal, retrenchment rhetorically. When you have the President of the United States take the recommendation of perhaps the most informed, forward-leaning, effective, and impactful military leader in the modern history of the country in Afghanistan, when General Petraeus calls for the complement of surge troops to be around at their maximum level a little while longer, not for 10 years or 20 years worth of nation building, but for at least the logical intermediate next step goal of making sure the Afghan security forces are trained in volume and quality so that it can at least reasonably take up more of the charge and the challenge of security in Afghanistan, and the President draws down those troops, notwithstanding that recommendation, and coincidentally very well timed compared to the political calendar. That strikes me as something that is a sense of withdrawal, retrenchment, and decline. And the list goes on. When you have the President of the United States say to Syria, notwithstanding the fact that Bashir al-Assad is not a reformer, is a known killer, is an enabler of terrorism, sends an ambassador back to Damascus, refuses and declines to address Syria, its behavior, and its leadership with any moral clarity, all of those things and more support those statements.
You said America is exceptional and that we have a moral clarity to lead the world. What is that moral clarity?
Well, the moral clarity is that we and other developed nations around the world support these principles and more. Human rights, free and fair elections, the free and fair flow of information, the ability for people to express themselves freely, to worship freely, to associate freely. Those are values and principles that we can speak to with moral clarity because they are our values, and they are shared by many around the world, but not all. And when people oppress them in tyrannical ways, we should, at the very least, speak to that. But we have moral clarity to do it because they're our values.
Well, for 2.5 centuries, we've dealt with the tension between...
And they're universal values as well.
The tension between those values in operation and the security issues that arise. So what do you do about a state? You mentioned radical Islam early on. What do you do with a state that chooses to oppose the United States and its interests, but out of the values, believing that they've followed a democratic process and have become what they believe they should be, but then pose a threat to the United States?
Which state would you highlight as an example of that? Which state has followed a democratic process that leads you to that conclusion?
But you're speaking about, you've run through a list of principles by which you would govern, and the tension between freedom and security is a perennial one. So at what point do you draw a line?
Okay, I thought your question was premised on there's a state that has a democratic result. But nonetheless, you know, these 4 categories I put forward in the speech was this. One is we have several countries who have gone through revolution and are at the doorstep of freedom. We should help them. 2 is we have these long-standing monarchies, many of whom have been somewhat or at least partially friendly to the United States. But you can see the handwriting on the wall. Their day is not long if they try to stay in their current form. Now, it may be a year, it may be 10 years, it may be 20 or 30, but they can't sustain the system that they're on. There's a continuum between where they are and more shared power with their people. We need to use the levers that we have, economically, militarily, socially, trade, and beyond, to move them as constructively as possible down the continuum from what they have now to a better place of shared power with their people. And then we have the failed states, or states that are directly threatening to the United States, and they include Syria, and they include Iran, hopefully not yet Yemen, but that could also be on the list, and they need to be dealt with in a different and more aggressive manner. And fourth, we need to recognize that we have our great ally Israel that does share our values and our principles and our security concerns, and we need to stand shoulder to shoulder with them as we confront and also embrace the challenges and opportunities of the region more broadly. So the essence of your question is where's the dividing line between democracy and tyranny, and the answer is you can't flip a switch overnight and move historically tyrannical governments to democracy, but you can use the levers that are available to try to nudge them, pressure them, cajole them, encourage them, inspire them, incentivize them to move down the continuum towards democracy. And it doesn't happen overnight. Look at, the Balkans, look at Romania, look at Serbia, look at Kosovo, look at Bosnia. These are not 1 or 2 year projects. These are 10, 20, multi-decade projects, and they take sustained, persistent commitment by people within the countries as well as their enablers and friends beyond. Reagan did great work in Romania and Poland and Afghanistan Part 1, not by always using direct military, explicit military intervention, but by lots of support mechanisms, and over time it changed the country. But it starts with a president who is going to lend moral clarity, clear voice, strength of vision, strength of values, so the individuals who are dissidents, reformers, dreamers, change agents in those countries hear the voice and know, at least aspirationally and directionally, we stand with them.
That's one question, then we'll go to the audience, the members. You made a very interesting historical linkage early on. The post-World War II era, the last decade of the Cold War, and the war on terror. As I'm taking it as 3 examples of equivalent triumphs. Define the war on terror and what you would do in the next phase of that if you were in power.
Well, we first need to recognize that this is not, there is not a known beginning and end to this yet. So we are accustomed to a mindset in this regard where people might see a clear beginning and a clear end to the challenge and to the need. But unlike some past conflicts, the war on terror is likely to be not just about Afghanistan and Iraq. It is going to be transnational. It is going to be multi-year, if not multi-decade. It is going to be episodic. It's going to ebb and flow. The threat will take different forms in different places at different times. It will be asymmetrical, and it will be significantly different, as we all well know, than some of the historical examples that you cite. But we need to steel ourselves for that future. There is only one person in the country who can continually lend voice and educate and raise awareness and remind the American people about the importance of this cause and the opportunities and risks of making sure that we remain vigilant. The people who killed 3,000 of our fellow citizens in this city and in other places on September 11, 2001 still exist. The organizations still exist. Their mindsets still exist. Their designs and plans still exist. And as soon as they have the opportunity to kill not 3,000 but 30,000 or 3 million or 30 million or 300 million, they will try. And this may not be just about how do you, in an orderly and reasonable, and I would add successful fashion, draw down the troops in Afghanistan. This is going to be about, do we have the steely-eyed, clear-eyed determination to see this threat, call it by name, identify it wherever and however it exists, and defeat it before it manifests itself and operationalizes itself in a way that's threatening to the security interests of the United States and our allies. That is going to be require persistence, diligence over a long, episodic period of time. But that is not the direction this president is headed, in my view, and it is not the direction, unfortunately, that a good chunk of even the Republican Party now seems to be headed, and I take sharp issue with both.
We will now take your questions. Please rise, wait for the microphone, state your name and affiliation. We'll start here. Start middle here.
Governor, thank you very much for your remarks. I'm wondering if you can shed some light on your support for the idea of change agents, so to speak, in Syria, in Libya, in Iran. Who are those change agents? How can you be assured that if President Assad was no longer in power, that the change agent that would be acceptable to Washington would be the individual who would sit in power in whatever capital it may be, as opposed to someone who could be possibly a bit, a Salafist, et cetera, but basically how do you have visibility on a change agent that no one in country really has visibility on right now?
Well, it's a very good question, but of course the premise is how can you guarantee X? And the answer is the world's a messy place and there is ultimately no guarantee in these uncertain situations. But when you're flying in the clouds and you're navigating in uncertain situations, you need to make sure your compass is set to true north or to proper compass headings. That's why it starts with making sure you have a president who enunciates, articulates forcefully, repeatedly, clearly what our values and principles and interests really are. And then number two, people didn't ask, what comes after Hitler? What could happen after that? Hitler was awful and needed to go. Now, is there danger about what comes next and risk? Of course. But let's take Libya as one example of many. And each of these countries is different. They have different cultures, histories, backgrounds, relationships with the United States. And a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter formula does not work for the Middle East. They have to be done strategically, but ultimately one at a time. In Libya, there are the kinds of risks that your question implies. But we also know that at least a significant chunk of the rebels are Western educated, seem to genuinely desire freedom and democracy or a better way, want markets and the like. Now, is that all of them? No. But are they going to be in competition between the former and the latter? Yes. And is it our best interest, assuming Gaddafi is going to go, and he is going to go, to try to maximize the odds that the folks who are favorable to our values prevail? Yes. So is there an absolute guarantee? Of course not. The world doesn't work like that. It's a messy, difficult, risky, complex place. But that doesn't mean we retreat and duck under the table. We get in there and compete with information, with ideas, with values, with resources, in the power of the marketplace. And again, this does not mean we invade militarily every country. There are a lot of levers you can pull, develop, and deploy that will influence the course of these countries. Can we guarantee the outcome? No. But in Libya, once the President of the United States says Gaddafi must go, and he has, you can't let a third-rate dictator thumb his nose at the President of the United States and the free world. Leaving him there indefinitely is not an option. And now, even if some would argue whether we had a vital interest initially, we have one now, and which is you can't leave Gaddafi sit there, because if he were to survive and reestablish any capability at all, I would guess one of his main motivations is going to be retaliation, and guess who it's going to be against. And so Gaddafi must now go. And letting him linger indefinitely while the president wrings his hands about what to do next is not a good idea. He needs to go.
Governor, you've mentioned President Reagan several times. As you look back, do you think your foreign policy approach would have more in common with George H.W. Bush or George W. Bush?
Well, I would like to believe I'll have my own foreign policy, that it will reflect upon the best of the foreign policy success of our country and Republicans. I think there are positive examples within both of those administrations on foreign policy successes, some challenges as well, obviously, but I don't think it's one or the other. I think there are strong and positive elements in both. And again, times change, circumstances change, so these are complex issues in complex parts of the world with lots of nuance, and to suggest a cookie-cutter doctrine for the region, I think is underutilization of our abilities, our capability, and our thoughtfulness. But there are elements of both that I would embrace.
You're not running in a primary right now, are you?
Yeah.
Sir, right here.
Yes.
My name is Isaac Shapiro.
1 second, sir.
I'm with the law firm of Skadden Arps. Just to get away from the Middle East for a moment, how would your policy toward North Korea be different from whatever the policy is today?
Well, North Korea is one of the most concerning challenges that we face in the foreign policy arena. I think North Korea will most likely best respond to a multifaceted approach, one prong of which is a prominent and important role for China in that discussion. And it's not the only lever, but it's an important lever. We don't have ultimate control over how and when and whether China exerts more influence in that discussion, but we need them to be involved. That doesn't mean we abdicate or defer or subjugate to China. We need to take a leadership role in it. And of course, you're dealing with a leadership structure that is fragile, uncertain, potentially erratic, unpredictable. Well, when you're facing these difficult situations, we have to get back to articulating what we stand for and what we believe. And so, first of all, articulate it, and second of all, are there ways to influence it? And again, North Korea is not Angola or Poland or Afghanistan, but to the extent we have levers, whether they be implicit or explicit, to try to change North Korea internally, that is a good option for us. At least it's one option for us. And we're going to need some help in the region. We have some people who are particularly connected to North Korea. But look at, for example, the transition in South Korea. Obviously, great success has been made there with a different system, different set of values, different approach. But I would suggest that Reagan gave us a pretty good blueprint about how you, short of an invasion, influence events inside a country that you're worried about in a constructive, positive way in many instances.
Ms. McFarland?
K.T. McFarland, I'm with Fox News. When you talked about, Gaddafi must go, Assad must go, and President Obama saying Mubarak must go, it's easy to say, but as we've seen, hard to do. Mubarak was pretty easy. Gaddafi's proving to be much more difficult. How would you deal with it with a little more specificity of how do you get Gaddafi to go? Boots on the ground, special operations forces directing, targeting, more of the same. Again, easy to say, hard to do if the guy decides he doesn't want to go.
Yeah. Well, first of all, start out by being consistent and clear about your expectations. In Egypt, we have a 82-year-old dictator who, whether it was this spring's revolution, next fall's election, or his likely heart attack or stroke or other infirmity, was not long for that position. And so now you have Mubarak there for 30-some years. And what was the plan between a 30-plus-year dictator and chaos? Answer, there wasn't one. He thought it was his kid. That wasn't going to work either. And so what was our plan? What had we done to prepare for that moment? Now, as it unfolds in an abrupt moment towards the end, we have President Biden say, Vice President Biden say, Mubarak is not a dictator. Really? Yes, he is. Then we have the director of our intelligence infrastructure go before Congress and say the Muslim Brotherhood is a largely secular organization. Really? Then we have Hillary Clinton say, don't worry, the situation in Egypt is stable, as mentioned in my remarks. No, it wasn't. And then she gratuitously adds something to the effect, and by the way, the Mubaraks and the Clintons are dinner friends. Well, how is that helpful as we reach out to the people on the street? And then they dispatch Wiesner to, I think, the Munich Security Conference or some event in Egypt, or in Europe, to issue a communique informally. Gibbs goes to the White House press room and says, Mubarak must now go. And we mean yesterday. And then, as I understand the chain of events, Wiesner goes and whispers to a designee of Mubarak that we didn't really mean it, you can stay a while, or something to that effect. So the point of all of that is, in the early days, hours, and weeks of this event in Egypt, we had a very confused, very uncoordinated, very unclear, very hesitant administration. Clearly, Mubarak was a dictator. Clearly, he was not long for his position. Clearly, we need to be in the business before chaos of trying to have some capacity in place for a better way forward in Egypt. So that took care of itself in terms of the events on the ground. But now we better be helping out with the NGOs and the others who are about the business of trying to build democratic capacity in Egypt and using the trade, economic, and military levers we have to maximize the likelihood that that will actually happen. Bashir Assad is not a reformer. And to this day, this administration, until very recently, would not utter the words, he needs to go and he's a killer. They were very hesitant to do it, and they implied he was a reformer and that there was still time and hope for him to renew himself. Now, does that mean we are now going to use military force in Syria? No, not necessarily. But are there other things we can do to try to effectuate change within Syria? Absolutely. And this administration, in my view, is reluctant to do it, doesn't see it, doesn't want to do it, isn't dedicated to it, doesn't believe it has a leadership role in it, and is leading from behind.
We have one question from the national.
And as to Gaddafi, this is not Afghanistan. It is a relatively simple place topographically. I'm not suggesting you need boots on the ground, but I believe it is a fair statement to say if the United States and its allies wants Gaddafi to go, he would be gone. I think you say to Gaddafi, essentially, you have X number of days to get your affairs in order. You can go the easy way or you can go the hard way, but you're going to go. By the way, Ronald Reagan tried to kill him in the 80s, missed him by a bedroom. He's a killer. He's got American blood on his hands. He's a terrorist, and now he's an indicted war criminal. There's more than sufficient reason to go get Gaddafi.
As president, would you have tried to follow the war powers resolution in Libyan military action, or would you have done what President Obama did?
Well, I would reserve as executive prerogative the argument that the War Powers Act does not apply. However, in the case that it might, and as a courtesy and out of respect for the Congress, I would have more fully consulted with them, because I think the case could have been made, presented successfully as a courtesy to the Congress, not necessarily as a legal obligation.
So you would have consulted more with Congress than President Obama did?
I think he had a couple of the leaders over for sandwiches. I think that could have been more systematic, more broad, and I think a strong case can be made on the merits that what we did in Libya was the correct course. I will tell you that on about March 7th, I said, establish or at least threaten the no-fly zone in Libya. At that moment, Gaddafi was on the ropes, the rebels had the momentum, they had taken over most of the country geographically, and he was openly, according to several news accounts, talking about leaving voluntarily. Had we seized the moment at that time, I think we would have nudged Gaddafi out without much fanfare and without much difficulty. Instead, the president dithered for the better part of a month, waited for the Arab League, waited for the United Nations, allowed Gaddafi to get off the canvas, regroup, regain momentum, take back more than half of the country, and give us the now complicated situation that we now have. That's very unfortunate. But as it relates to the case that could have been made and should have been made to the Congress on how to do that, as a courtesy and gesture of respect, I would have done that, but I don't concede the notion that it was required by the War Powers Act.
We have a question from the national program online. It's from Dennis Jett of Penn State. In a recent debate, you said Iraq was a shining example for the Middle East. A number of experts at a recent meeting said they thought the Shiite majority was going to eliminate the Sunni minority by driving them out of the country or worse. My question is, for whom is Iraq a shining example?
Well, for those who like democracy, more open societies, increasing appreciation for democratic institutions and principles. So is Iraq guaranteed to be a shining example forever or much longer? No. Is it a lot better than it was in recent years? Absolutely. So again, this is on a continuum, and it's on a moment in time. If you look around the Middle East, with the exception of our great ally Israel and Turkey, and you were trying to rank order nations that are next on the progress meter in terms of movement towards democracy, openness, and the like, you'd have to put Iraq moving in the right direction. Now, is it guaranteed to stay that way in light of sectarian concerns, in light of other challenges within Iraq? We don't know the answer to that. But in this moment of time, is it an example of progress that can and has been made in a difficult region with a complex and long, seemingly insurmountable history? Absolutely.
Let's go back, please, sir.
Hi, Jim Traub with the New York Times Magazine. I want to re-ask a question that John asked you about states that democratically choose leaders who are opposed to American values, that conundrum. I assume that one of the reasons the Obama administration hesitated in the case of Egypt was that they thought that whoever would replace President Mubarak would be more anti-American and anti-Israel. That's simply the logic of democracy in a region where anti-Americanism runs high. So do you have a reason to think that that's wrong? Or if it's correct, are you saying that the United States should be prepared to pay that strategic price for the important moral gain of having a more democratic Middle East?
But I want to make sure I understand your question. Are you asserting that the elections in Egypt were legitimate?
No, no, no. My question was this, that the fear of not only the Obama administration but others was that since the Middle Eastern public is broadly anti-American, if you spend time there you wouldn't have any doubt about that, for reasons having to do with Israel and other things, a democratic election in a country like Egypt or Jordan or any countries in that region are going to bring to power people who are more anti-American than these autocratic regimes which don't have to respond to public opinion. So that might be a price that the United States has to pay in order to bring about a more democratic Middle East. Do you have reason to think that that, in fact, is not such a price, or if it is, would you say a price worth paying?
Well, I think you need to look at this over time. So we have monarchies, for example, I think the third category in my speech, that we have accommodated, tolerated, supported, engaged with on a tactical and strategic level over many years and many decades. And the argument for not pressuring them too much for change is because they have accommodated us with respect to our security interests. And that has been the bargain, unspoken or spoken. Oversimplified, but I think that's the essence of what you're describing. So the next question is how much longer in the world of Twitter, Facebook, social networking, instant media all the time, everywhere, is that sustainable? And if you believe it is not in the intermediate and long term sustainable, are we best served to at least try to move those countries down the continuum towards a better future so the transition can be orderly, predictable, and more likely successful than have it erupt in a cataclysmic moment of revolution, the debris, the political debris, and security debris for which is uncertain. And that is what I tried to describe in the remarks. And so I hope you caught that. But the point wasn't to say to these third group monarchies that are described in the speech that we're going to demand or otherwise require you to flip a switch from what you are now to democracy in 24 hours. What I am trying to say is you think about, even within the realm of monarchies, you have current Middle Eastern monarchies all the way to, say, Spain or UK, more ceremonial, obviously. Over a reasonable period of time, with our friendship, relationship, leverage, mutual interests, hopefully increasing amounts of shared values, can we move them on a continuum so that they have more shared power with their people? It begins to convince the people in those countries that there is hope in an orderly fashion, and it decreases the likelihood of a dramatic or catastrophic moment for which the outcome is even more uncertain. So that's what I'm trying to describe, at least for that category of countries. Now, there's also, keep in mind, the failed states and those who've already gone through the revolution in the four categories in the speech.
And to be clear, you're not trying to send a message to Elizabeth II. Watch out. You're with us or against us, sir. I knew we'd get Kate Middleton in here somehow.
Bob Grady from Cheyenne Capital Fund in the state of New Jersey. You implied in your remarks, and actually in the answer to one of the follow-up questions, that Secretary Clinton and the President were too slow to embrace and support the reform movement in Egypt. What do you make of the argument that actually we were too quick as a country to abandon President Mubarak, our ally of 35 years, quite unlike Gaddafi or Assad, and that by not having what you just described, a more sort of orderly transition, we could reap the whirlwind as access is open to the Gaza Strip dramatically, and that could be a pathway for weapons that would threaten the state of Israel?
I don't accept the premise because Mubarak's days were numbered any way you count them. He was either gone in the revolution, gone in the election, or gone through human life expectancy bans sometime within the next few years. So the question isn't whether Mubarak was going to go. The question is what was going to happen once he went. And it happened more suddenly because of the revolution. But when you have 32 years worth of his reign featuring things like the 2010 parliamentary elections, which are clearly stolen, which are unquestionably stolen by any reasonable or fair-minded assessment of those elections, and the United States of America says nothing, that sends a pretty powerful signal. Now, was that the only thing that cumulatively led to the problems Mubarak had? No, but was it one recent example? Was it perhaps the straw that broke the camel's back or the match that got thrown into the kindling? Maybe, but it's endemic of and emblematic of the 32 years worth of suppression, tyranny, dictatorship, denial of rights, secret police, stolen elections. And if you do that long enough, eventually you're going to have a problem. It is predictable, it's inevitable, it's undeniable, and we need to get ahead of it, not behind it. And that same pattern will come for every one of those countries in the region eventually. So the question isn't what's the outcome, the question is can we make that outcome more orderly, predictable, stable, secure, and more oriented towards the values, views, and security interests of the United States. But I don't fundamentally accept the premise that one option was to leave Mubarak around. He wasn't around much longer any way you cut it.
Governor, thank you for a thoughtful morning.
You're welcome.
Very great.
Thank you. Thank you.